Lord Hill of Orford.
My Lords, as the Chief Whip has just reminded us, a large number of people want to speak today. The House is full. And I think that shows why it was right to recall Parliament, a decision that I know the opposition strongly supported. My Lords, in setting out the government's position on the use of chemical weapons in Syria, I hope to do three things. First, I want to set out the evidence that we have of the use of chemical weapons. Then I want to set out the government's case for action. And then I will explain the process we intend to follow, both here and in the international community. But first, I think it's important to be clear what the issue we're considering today is not. It is not about taking sides in the Syrian conflict. It is not about invading. It is not about regime change or even about working more closely with the Syrian opposition. Now, I know we'll hear this afternoon from many noble lords with a huge amount of experience, diplomatic, political, military, and I'm sure we'll hear many nuanced arguments and that there will be discussion about the complexities of the situation. I know we'll benefit greatly from that advice. But, my Lords, in essence, the issue is really very simple. And it is this: what should our response be to the large-scale use of chemical weapons? And with that response, what message do we want to send to the rest of the world about their use? To help us in our debate, the government have placed a number of documents in the library. There's a summary of the government's legal position, making explicit that military action would have a clear legal basis, and the key judgments of the Joint Intelligence Committee, making clear their view of what happened and who is responsible. And I hope noble lords will find that information useful. So, my lords, let me start with the evidence that we have. Médecins Sans Frontières reported that in just 3 hours on the morning of the 21st of August, 3 hospitals in the Damascus area of Syria received approximately 3,600 patients with symptoms consistent with chemical weapon attacks. Thousands of social media reports and at least 95 videos record evidence of attacks in at least 11 different locations in the Damascus area. There are horrible pictures of bodies showing signs of nerve agent exposure, including muscle spasms and foaming at the nose and mouth. At least 350 were killed. These deaths and injuries were caused by weapons that have been outlawed for nearly a century. The fact that the most recent attack took place is not seriously disputed. The Syrian government said that it took place, but blamed the opposition. Even the Iranian president has said that it took place. The Syrian regime resisted calls for immediate and unrestricted access for UN inspectors, while artillery and rocket fire in the area reached a level around 4 times higher than in the 10 preceding days. Examining all this evidence, together with the available intelligence, the Joint Intelligence Committee has made its judgments, published and placed in the library in the form of a letter from the chairman of the committee to the Prime Minister. And the committee reached its judgments in line with the reforms put in place after the Iraq War by the noble Lord Butler of Brockwell. The letter states, and I quote, "There is little serious dispute that chemical attacks causing mass casualties on a larger scale than hitherto took place on the 21st of August. So far as the Syrian opposition is concerned, the letter states, there is no credible intelligence or other evidence to substantiate the claims or the possession of chemical weapons by the opposition. The Joint Intelligence Committee therefore concluded it is not possible for the opposition to have carried out a chemicals weapons attack on this scale. It says, the regime has used chemical weapons on a smaller scale on at least 14 occasions in the past. There is some intelligence to suggest regime culpability in this attack. These factors make it highly likely that the Syrian regime was responsible. The JIC chairman in his letter makes this point absolutely clear and says, there are no plausible alternative scenarios to regime responsibility. To believe the Syrian opposition were behind the attack, we would have to believe that the opposition would use, on a large scale, weapons that we have no evidence they have, delivered by artillery or by air power they do not possess, killing hundreds of people in areas already under their control. And, my lords, I think that is simply not credible. Whatever disagreements we may have about the complex situation in Syria, there is surely no disagreement that the use of chemical weapons is wrong. And for nearly a century, the international community has worked to build a system of defences to protect mankind against their use. The international agreement outlawing the use of chemical weapons was signed by Syria and dates back to the period after the Great War, a war in which 90,000 soldiers died from mustard gas, chlorine, phosgene, and up to 1.3 million were blinded or burned by them. The Geneva Protocol reflected a determination that the events of the Great War should never be repeated, and it said that whatever happens, these weapons should not be used. Our judgment is that this is the first significant use of chemical weapons this century. Together with the previous 14 smaller scale attacks, this is the only instance of regular and indiscriminate use of chemical weapons by a state against its own people for at least 100 years. We should not be interfering in another country's affairs except in the most exceptional circumstances. In those circumstances, it would have to be a humanitarian catastrophe, and it would have to be as a last resort. By any standards, my lords, this is a humanitarian catastrophe. If there are no consequences for the large-scale use of chemical weapons, then there would be nothing to stop Assad and other dictators from using them again and again. If there are no consequences for breaking international agreements, then the agreements themselves are rendered meaningless. Decades of painstaking work to construct an international system of rules and checks to prevent the use of chemical weapons and to destroy stockpiles would be undone, and a 100-year-old taboo would be breached. My lords, I know that there are those who argue that in considering our options, we should be guided only by what is in the British national interest. I agree, but surely it is in our national interest, and that of all nations, to ensure that the rules about chemical weapons are upheld. And that is why the government argue that we should play our part in a strong response from the international community, first at the United Nations, but also potentially including legal and proportionate military action, action designed simply to prevent the future use of chemical weapons and similar human distress. My lords, the Attorney General has confirmed that this use of chemical weapons in Syria constitutes both a war crime and a crime against humanity. The Cabinet considered the Attorney's advice this morning, and a summary of the government's legal position has been placed in the library, as I've said. And this summary sets out that the principle of humanitarian intervention does provide a sound legal basis for the deployment of UK forces and military assets in an operation to deter and disrupt the use of chemical weapons. My lords, we have evidence of the use of chemical weapons and a firm and sound basis to act, but we propose to take further steps, both here and at the United Nations, before we do so. First, the United Nations weapons investigators in Damascus must complete their work and brief the United Nations Security Council. We will also make an attempt to reach a condemnatory Chapter 7 resolution in the Security Council, backing all necessary measures. We yesterday put a new draft resolution to our Security Council colleagues. My lords, I know, forgive me, and that in doing that, we must pursue every avenue at the United Nations, every diplomatic channel, every option for securing the greatest possible legitimacy for any action we take. Only once that route has been exhausted would the Prime Minister return to the House of Commons to seek a further resolution of that House to endorse British involvement in direct military action. My Lords, I know that there is a series of important questions about any potential operation to deter and disrupt the use of chemical weapons to relieve humanitarian suffering. Let me try to deal with these. The first is, how could we be sure that the military action envisaged by the United States of America or its allies would work? And of course, it's true that when dealing with a dictator like the Syrian president, there can be no guarantee of dissuading him from the further use of chemical weapons. But our judgment reflects the assessment is that Assad is likely to fear and respect a strong and focused response. There is, of course, no action without risk, but alongside the risk of action, we have to weigh the risks of inaction. We know that in President Assad, we have a man who has stockpiled chemical weapons, has used them repeatedly and indiscriminately in the past. He has repeatedly tested our resolve to stand up to his crimes. If we do not act, he and others will, I believe, take it as a signal that he can use chemical weapons again and again. And that would risk not only further chemical attacks and further human suffering in Syria, but also greater proliferation of these weapons across the region and the world, with all the consequences that could bring. And we should not tolerate the risks of inaction, nor allow Assad and other dictators to conclude that they can continue to deploy chemical weapons against their people with impunity. There are those who ask as well whether we're in danger of getting sucked into a new war in the Middle East. And to them I would say that the issue before us today is not about sanctioning wider involvement in Syria, horrible and devastating as that conflict is. It's purely about responding specifically to the large-scale use of chemical weapons and acting to deter and prevent them from being used again. The next question is whether we're in danger of undermining our ambitions for a political solution in Syria. And the government doesn't believe here that there is a choice between, on the one hand, acting to prevent chemical weapons being used against the Syrian people, and on the other, continuing to push for a long-term political solution. We obviously need to do both, and we remain committed to using diplomacy to end this war with a political solution. But for as long as Assad is able to defy international will, he will feel little, if any, pressure to come to the negotiating table. So far from undermining the political process, a strong and military response to the use of chemical weapons can actually strengthen it. Some ask whether action over chemical weapons could further destabilize the region. Well, the region has already been profoundly endangered by the conflict in Syria. Lebanon faces sectarian tensions as refugees flood across the border. Jordan is coping with a huge influx of refugees. Turkey, our ally in NATO, has suffered terrorist attacks and shelling from across the border. But standing by as a new chemical weapons threat emerges won't alleviate those challenges, it will only deepen them. And that's why the Arab League has been so clear in calling for international action. A region long beset by conflict and aggression needs clear international laws and people who are prepared to stand up for them. My Lords, there's also the question of whether intervention, however well motivated, could risk radicalising more young Muslims, including here in Britain. And this is a vital question, and it's one which the National Security Council addressed yesterday. The government received considered analysis from our counter-terrorism experts, and their assessment is that, while there's no room for complacency, the legal, proportionate and focused actions that we would propose would not be a significant new cause of radicalisation and extremism. And in fact, young Muslims in the region and here in Britain may well be wondering if the world will ever step up and respond to the pictures of Muslims in Syria suffering horrific injuries and death from chemical weapons. And the message I would argue to give them is that we will. Now, our Parliament has on relatively few occasions been asked to consider whether to endorse the principle of the use of military force. It is inevitable that today's debate here, and perhaps particularly in the other place, will be viewed with the perspective of the debates held before our interventions in Libya and indeed in Iraq. Given that perspective, I think we're right in Parliament and as a nation to be cautious and to strive to be consensual. And that is why we've published the summary of our legal position and the key judgments of the Joint Intelligence Committee. It is why we've deferred our decision until the United Nations inspectors have completed their immediate work and briefed the Security Council. It is why we want to try to secure a Security Council resolution. But the situation today is not the same as in 2003 on the eve of the Iraq War. We are not invading another country. We are not searching for weapons. We've sadly already seen their use. In 2003, Europe, NATO, and the Arab League were in disagreement. Today, they are in agreement. The Arab League has issued a statement holding the Syrian regime fully responsible and asking the international community to overcome internal disagreements and take action against those who committed this crime. Australia, Canada, Turkey, and India, to name but a few, are also in agreement. So I would argue, my lords, that the question is a simpler one now than then, and it's how to respond to one of the worst uses of chemical weapons in 100 years. Do we conclude that it is all too difficult, and so send the message to Assad and others that they may use chemical weapons with impunity, or should we, as the government proposes, act in a legal, proportionate, and focused way with the single objective of preventing the further use of chemical weapons to relieve humanitarian suffering? My lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My lords, I'm grateful to the Noble Lord the Leader for his measured and informative introduction to our debate this afternoon. Information and answers to questions about the situation and proposed action in Syria have been lacking, so I warmly welcome this debate. I'm pleased that the Leader responded positively to our request that this House should be recalled today for consideration of the plans for military intervention, and I echo the thanks from the Noble Baroness, the Chief Whip, to the staff of this House. It is right that it is the Commons that should debate and vote on the issue of armed force, both to hold the government to account and in order to confer legitimacy on any military intervention. But it is also right that our own House should in parallel debate the issue. The Constitutional Committee said in its timely report on constitutional arrangements for the use of armed force, we consider that the House of Lords is well placed to debate deployment decisions, but that the approval of such decisions should be for the Commons. The motion before us in this House is rightly couched in very general terms, but that does not detract from the critical and grave nature of the issues before us: acts of war, the stark reality of life, death, and global stability. The burden of responsibility will lie on the shoulders of our colleagues in the other place, but the voice of Noble Lords will carry great influence both in Parliament and throughout the country. In our daily debates on legislation, we rightly speak of the consequences, often painful, that laws will have on the lives of individuals and wider society. But the decisions taken in the other place on this issue relate to life and death. It could be said that to carry out military action will definitely cost lives, but the decision not to take action could also cost lives. As Noble Lords will be aware, my party has tabled an amendment to the government's motion in the Commons which provides clear, logical and sequential steps that must be taken before any further vote in the other place. I pay tribute to the strong and cool-headed leadership shown by Ed Miliband on this issue in the interests of our country. I regret that it's being briefed that he's been playing politics. My lords, he is not. He is providing measured statesmanship. I trust that the amendment will be carried because I fear that the government motion is ambiguous and such a grave decision must be preceded by a roadmap. This is what the brave men and women of our armed forces and their families, along with the rest of our nation, would expect. I pay tribute to the work of our armed forces who bear the consequences of decisions that are taken. We are hugely proud of the work that they do. The use of chemical weapons is abhorrent, a moral outrage and a crime against humanity. The question as to whether or not chemical weapons have been used in Syria seems to be beyond doubt evidence of man's inhumanity towards man. Governments, the Arab League, journalists and non-governmental organisations, along with sources contacted by the intelligence services, agree on the use of chemical weapons. Following the attack on Damascus, the UN team of inspectors is now collecting samples which will be sent to special laboratories for rigorous analysis before the team reports to the UN Secretary-General and the Security Council. As the Secretary-General said yesterday, the team must be given time to do its job. Such actions are not and must not be a SOP, but part of the robust UN process. Whilst the team is not mandated to discover who used the chemical weapons, it is clear that the evidence they collect should provide information about who was responsible. It is then that the Security Council will best be able to consider what action should be taken. This must be part of the due process. It is important that the Arab League said on Tuesday that it holds Bashar al-Assad responsible for the chemical attack on Damascus, and they support the use of force through the UN. We look to the US government, our own government, and others to set out their evidence in relation to the responsibility of the Assad regime. I have one very specific question for the Minister in response. Can the government tell us what chemical weapon caused the appalling injuries and deaths in Ghouta? And was it a prescribed chemical weapon under the Chemical Weapons Convention? My Lords, action must only be taken on the basis of evidence. Momentum is not a reason for action, so why the undue speed? Such momentous decisions cannot be taken in haste. There must be evidence before a decision is made, rather than a decision taken before the evidence is available. The government must not work to a political timetable, but must do what is best for our country, best for the Syrian people, and best for the wider world. Like all noble lords, I've had many conversations this week about the government's desire for action, and whatever the views expressed, all speak of the need for clarity and have asked a series of questions which must be answered. I hope that today the government will be able to give real clarity about the aims of intervention and the outcome. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister said that he sought to deter and degrade the further use of chemical weapons by Syria. Yet in a tweet yesterday, he said that Britain has drafted a resolution condemning the chemical weapons attack by Assad and authorising necessary measures to protect civilians. What is the government trying to achieve? Although I recognise that the noble lord, the leader, gave some of those answers. Is the aim of any action to punish Assad for the past use of chemical weapons, to deny the future use of chemical weapons by taking out the potential for future use, to deter future use, or to exercise a responsibility to protect civilians in Syria? I would ask the noble lord the minister to be absolutely clear on this. Many people, including many noble lords, might be prepared to support action, but only if it were possible to be assured that we could remove and neutralise every single chemical capability in Syria. They would want unequivocal proof that this was achievable and the sole aim of military action. Civilian lives are lost in any military action, no matter how strategic. So would it be possible to punish Assad or teach him a lesson if it is his countrymen who suffer rather than him and his henchmen? His repugnant actions demonstrate that he does not value the lives of others. 100,000 already killed and nearly 2 million refugees are clear and tangible proof of his devastating cruelty. A nation destroyed and a whole generation with little or no hope for the future. I've seen this with my own eyes. I visited a camp in Jordan nearly 2 years ago when there were merely tens of thousands of refugees, and it was a deeply shocking experience. I watched a family that included elderly people bent double, walking with help, and tiny children all fleeing across the border from snipers. Their warm reception in Jordan was extraordinary. Now there are millions of people who have fled the country with no hope, no home, no dreams, just physical and mental problems. How can they continue to cope? Likewise, Jordan, Turkey, the Lebanon and other countries to which they flee. Would any military intervention make the flow of refugees even greater or smaller? Likewise, the 6.8 million people inside Syria, including the 4.25 million internally displaced people. The humanitarian crisis is bordering on an emergency. We have to ask ourselves if military action would improve the lives of those people. Would it improve the humanitarian situation and the ability of aid agencies to provide help? Further questions are rightly asked about the proportionality and legality for action. Any action must have regard to the potential consequences in the region and must be legal, proportionate and time-limited. Understandably, there are fears about mission creep, which might follow any action. As the US Chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey, has said, once we take action, we should be prepared for what comes next. Deeper involvement is hard to avoid. My Lords, what is the end game of any action? If there were a military intervention followed by further use of chemical weapons, wouldn't we be obliged to strike again? One of the deepest concerns that is expressed and that I share is about the wider consequences of any action. It is probably impossible to know or to calculate what the consequences would be, but has the government really thought through the balance of risks? What would be the ramifications across the Arab and Muslim world? As the noble Lord Williams of Baglan pointed out in an excellent article earlier this week, comparisons are inevitably being made with military actions in Kosovo in 1999 and Libya in 2011. In both cases, neither Serbia nor Libya had friends whose support they could rely on, but this is not the case with Syria. Syria is firmly embedded in an alliance with Iran and Hezbollah, which poses real dangers for the wider world. I look forward to the speech later today from the noble Lord, who is wise and has unparalleled recent experience in the region. How would Iran respond? Would the hopes of better relations between the recently elected, more moderate president of Iran and the West be jeopardized? And does the President Assad's warning of dire consequences encompass Israel, where US Secretary of State John Kerry's insistent diplomacy is impressive? Are these risks outweighed by the risk to this world of the use of chemical weapons with impunity? What are the consequences of this country? And by taking action, would the government be acting in the best interests of our own country? These questions are difficult and uncomfortable, but they are the questions that are being asked in various ways up and down the country by a public which remains deeply sceptical about intervention. Undoubtedly, some of the public's hostility is a result of the recent experiences we have had, but we must not be paralysed by the experience of Iraq. Rather, we should learn from the experience. My lords, political leaders must lead and the government must govern. They have information which influences their decisions, which we are not party to, but it is incumbent upon the government to be as open and as transparent as possible. However, politicians must also take the views of the public into account. This is not a question of votes at the next election, but the conscience of the nation. President Kennedy said, "Mankind must put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind." Perhaps we should ask if our intervention would put an end to the use of chemical weapons, not just in Syria, but their potential use in the wider world by other evil tyrants. The use of chemical weapons is the act of a despicable tyrant, a global bully. My lords, the moral case for action is clear. Chemical weapons cannot be used with impunity. There can be no free pass for those who use them, and military intervention must be an option. But is a military strike the best way to deal with an immoral, unprincipled bully with no regard for humankind? This is the first time that these vile weapons of war have been used in the 21st century, and I wonder if we really are considering 21st means of dealing with a dire situation. There is a duty on the international community to make the UN process work and to get maximum support. Diplomacy and political action must be pursued, and eventually President Assad and his closest associates must be brought before the International Court for judgment. Should the global powers not remain steadfastly committed to talking and to the Geneva II peace conference, my lords, the words of John Lennon, "Give peace a chance," are loud in many ears. I look forward to the debate and, of course, to the response from the Minister. I welcome the opportunity that the noble Lord has to and the noble leader has had to inform the House about the objectives, legal basis and anticipated effect of any possible UK military action in Syria. Today's vote in the House of Commons is not a green light for action. The decision as to whether or not to support any military intervention will be taken in the House of Commons once the report of the weapons inspectors has been received. It must also be on the basis of real evidence as to the perpetrators of the chemical attacks, follow proper consideration by and a vote in the Security Council. There must be a clear legal basis for proportionate action, and in-depth consideration must have been given to the consequences and risks. Our colleagues in the Commons will then be in a position to take the grave decision about military action involving UK forces. Naturally, I trust that this House will again be recalled when that decision is taken.
To thank the Leader of the House for giving us this opportunity to debate one of the most critical issues of our time, what to do about Syria. We've had several debates in this House, and I'm not going to rehearse the arguments that I made in the last debate when I spoke on this on the 1st of July earlier this year. Needless to say, for those who were there in that debate, I should add that my views have not changed. Whether to intervene or not is not merely a matter of legality and international law. It is also about judgment. It is about conscience, and it is about consequences. To act has consequences. That may be grave indeed, but to choose inaction also has consequences, perhaps graver than if we acted. We cannot know all of the outcomes in advance. What we can do is to strive to make a situation better than we might if we did nothing. International law, like other codified and customary law, is an evolving thing, subject to different interpretations. Parliamentarians and statesmen cannot make choices on the basis of naked law alone, as there will always be ambiguity regarding the appropriate analogies and past practice. No one situation is exactly like the last. Witness how different analogies are being employed today. This is like Kosovo, it's like the Iraq War, it's like Halabja, it's like the Iran-Iraq War, like World War I, and so on. I want to make the point that we cannot make decisions on a narrow perception of legality founded only on United Nations Security Council resolutions, particularly when it may not be open to us, that course of action may not be open to us due to the cynical use of a veto by Russia and China in order to protect their geopolitical interests, irrespective of the human catastrophe that is unfolding day by day and has unfolded over the last few years. I'm extremely relieved that this government has decided to wait for the UN weapons inspectors to confirm the use of chemical weapons. But let us remind ourselves that they will not point the finger. That is not their remit, and they undoubtedly would not have been allowed into Syria if that had been their remit. Moreover, we have to recall that there was intensive and continuous shelling and bombardment of Ghouta in the days after the attack, potentially to destroy chemical and ballistic evidence. So we need to be clear as to their ability, the weapons inspectors' ability, to solve this conundrum for us. When we're back in the hands of the Security Council and in the realm of law, will Russia and China, if it is proven that the Syrian regime was behind the attack, live up to their obligations under the 1925 Geneva Protocols on the use to act to enforce the provisions when they're breached? I doubt it, my lords. So let me put this question to the Labour Party, whose amendment in the other place is somewhat self-contradictory. What will they do if the weapons inspectors provide information to suggest that only the Assad regime had the capacity to undertake this attack? Their clause 3 of the amendment they're moving in the other place today requires a vote in the Security Council. The noble Lady Royal, for whom I have great respect, has just spelt that out herself. But they do not spell out what they might do when, despite inspectors' evidence, if it is forthcoming, there is a Russian or Chinese veto. Lord Wood argued in the debate on Syria on 1st July that we should, and I quote in Hansard column 993, quote, "We should spend diplomatic capital on urging other actors in the region not to take action that escalates the conflict from either side." Hallelujah, I say. But we're not in a position where we have that influence. We're not in a position where we have that influence with Russia or China. And what would they do if Hezbollah used chemical weapons in Lebanon? The situation there is increasingly destabilized. It's asymmetric in Lebanon as well as in Syria. If the strategy of deterrence is not employed, and this is what it is, that's what we're trying to do here. It is a strategy of deterrence, to deter Assad and his allies from using chemical weapons on a larger scale in the future, by demonstrating that we will not stand idly by. If deterrence is not employed, then how do we, in our state of impotence, prevent escalation or repeats? Let me conclude by adding one important point from a Muslim perspective, my lords. I have lived and been in and out of the Middle East since 1973. I have spent the last 40 years trying to understand why anti-Western sentiment is growing in the region. I have returned from Egypt only earlier this month. I know Lord Warner is here. He listened to the same protestations that I heard in Cairo. One of the things my interlocutors say again and again is that the West only engages with them when our own strategic interests are involved, such as our energy needs in the Middle East. In Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, I hear the same refrain. You don't protect our rights, only your own interests. A familiar question arises now with Muslims in the UK. We need to act with caution to dispel this perception. We need to be true to our values, but also to be true to our responsibilities.
My Lords, it will not surprise those of your Lordships who have heard or read my previous interventions on Syria that I am strongly against any form of military intervention in what has long been a Sunni-Shia war. I still believe that any military attack on Syrian territory by either the Americans or the French or ourselves will have disastrous consequences, quite apart from the inevitable loss of life, to add to the appalling casualties inflicted by 2 years of this terrible war. When I spoke in this House on the eve of our military invasion of Iraq in March 2003, I drew particular attention to the inconsistencies of our alleged objectives for that attack. I do so again, as did the noble Baroness Lady Royal, in the context of an imminent military assault on Syria. Is our objective, as American statements appear to confirm, merely to punish President Assad for his alleged deployment of chemical weapons? Is it a shot across the bows, as President Obama said, I think, this morning, to dissuade President Assad from deploying chemical weapons again? Is it part of a campaign to get rid of President Assad and his government and to replace it by the so-called Free Syrian Army? Is it designed to put pressure on President Assad to enter into negotiations at a Geneva peace conference? Or is it aimed at the destruction of his acknowledged stock of chemical weapons? Is it designed to be a warning to Iran, for Israel's benefit, of the readiness of the Americans to launch attacks against weapons of mass destruction? As for punishment, it is not clear to me, and I regret that I have not yet been able to read the note on the government's legal position, whether the government regard military action without the consent of the Security Council as legitimate under international law. Even if one accepts that the use of chemical weapons, whether by the Syrian government, the rebels, or both, is itself a breach of international law, does that justify an illegal response? We are assured that any action taken will be proportionate, but we also need assurance that the action taken will be legal. Surely any military intervention, however proportionate, will be interpreted by much of the wider world as direct involvement in Syria's civil war. If the planned military action is designed to change Syria's government, I would argue, as I have many times in this House, that it is no business of ours, or indeed of our NATO partners, to intervene on either side in Syria's civil war. Have we considered the risks of Syria's arsenal of chemical weapons falling under the control of the dominant rebel force, namely Jabhat al-Nusra and their al-Qaeda allies, in addition to the chemical weapons and agents to which, according to my information, they do already have access? If this is a virtual declaration of war against an ally of Russia and Iran, have we given adequate thought to our longer term and surely more important interests in either country, let alone our hopes of persuading them to put pressure themselves on their Syrian ally? If our aim is to destroy President Assad's stock of chemical weapons, others are better qualified than I to judge the risks of proliferation and civilian casualties, risks which were aired in debates preceding the Second Iraq War, when it seemed likely that the Americans were intent on destroying what turned out to be Saddam Hussein's non-existent weapons of mass destruction. How confident are we that any destruction this time would be total, safe, or effective? If, on the other hand, we argue that military action is necessary to persuade President Assad to enter into negotiations with the rebels, does this not ignore the fact that President Assad himself has confirmed repeatedly that he is ready to attend a Geneva conference, whereas not one of the rebel groups has agreed to do so? Surely our objective should be not to punish either side in this terrible civil war, but to bring all sides to the negotiating table with the help and assistance of their friends and allies. I see that the Russian foreign minister has expressed the hope that others will think of their long-term interests. Have we agreed with our American and French allies an exit strategy? How do we react if President Assad does use chemical weapons again? What happens if he or his allies launch some form of counterattack? My lords, it is ironic that this crisis should blow up precisely at the moment when we at last await Sir John Chilcot's report of his inquiry into the Second Iraq War. But I think we should have already learnt enough lessons from that disastrous campaign to avoid making any of the same mistakes again. Yeah.